Irene Khalifa is a senior advisor for dialogue promotion at the International Crisis Group, and she joins us now from Cairo in Egypt. Doreen, thank you so much for taking the time. So we should just note that this violence erupted, as we noted, in Soweda over the past few days. It's killed dozens of people. There is a fragile ceasefire in place that's just been announced. The Syrian Interior Ministry told the Associated Press that clashes fundamentally are not sectarian in nature. Now, if this looks and sounds familiar in Syria, we saw similar sectarian clashes back in March, and that was when hundreds of Alawite Syrians were killed. This case involves Druze and Bedouins in Syria. Talk to us about the dynamics at play right now.
Thank you so much for having me, Biana. I mean, there is absolutely a sectarian angle to this. I mean, the sectarian dynamic in Syria is very prevalent. It's something the Assad regime, both Bashar and Hafez, have entrenched in the society over 50 years of their rule. However, I think it is important to not look at all these breakdown in security happening across Syria only from a sectarian lens, because in essence, it is a struggle between a central nascent government that is trying to assert its control and trying to assert its dominance and monopoly over use of force, and then all these other non-state armed groups across the country who are trying to preserve a level of autonomy that allows them to maintain their military capabilities and their civil administration as well. That applies to the Druze community, it applies to the Kurdish community, it really applies across the country. It is a struggle that we have seen occur throughout the last 7 months, and I think it will continue to occur unless and until there are political agreements between the government and these communities that kind of addresses their concerns. And again, some of these concerns are sectarian by nature. The Druze community, the local population is concerned, and it doesn't help that factions associated to the central government are chanting these sectarian slogans, are misbehaving, are committing crimes against civilians. It does really give the impression within these communities that the government either is unable or unwilling to control factions that are operating under its umbrella.
So that raises the question of how much control al-Shaara's government has at this point of the country.
It's more control than I thought he would. It's less control than what the Syrians expect him to achieve. Now, we have to put things in perspective. It's only been 7 months since the fall of Assad. Since then, the Syrian government has been operating on a million fronts. They've been focusing primarily on their foreign relations in order to remove a web of U.S. and European sanctions that have been suffocating the country economically. They understand that this is a priority. The second priority has been trying to merge all the armed groups that have been operating in different parts of Syria under their command and control. Now, they've done a lot of progress in terms of merging in Sunni factions, specifically those who have been either backed by Turkey or operating very closely to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group that Ahmad had presided over prior to becoming the Syrian president. Now, that excludes a chunk of the country that is under the Kurdish-led forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, that have been backed by the U.S. and the international coalition, and Druze militias operating in the south. As well, obviously, as former regime remnants who still have some form of presence in the western flanks of the country.
The al-Shaara takeover and overthrowing of Bashar al-Assad's government, which really surprised the world at the rate and speed with which it happened at the tail end of the Biden administration. And we know at the time the transitional government promised to form a new government that would include much of the minority groups there and addressing the concerns about the sectoral divide in the country. The 23 new member government in Syria that was announced just a few weeks ago, though, only includes one Druze member. So how much concern and how much valid concern is there that that initial pledge isn't being lived up to?
You're absolutely right. There's been a lot of talk from Bashar and from the government about inclusivity, about diversity, about being a government for all of Syrians. However, very little of that has been reflected not only in the composition of the government, but also in the composition of the military, the security forces, and also in the implementation of certain policies and the constitutional declaration that they've announced a few months back. That is quite concerning, not just to minority groups, but also to secular and liberal Syrians who would like to see a diverse country and would like to see a new era in their country. So yes, there's one Druze member, and I think that was the problem, that they kind of made it out to be a quota system in which there's one woman, one Druze, one Kurd, one Alawite. And people are asking the question, do these people actually have, not only are they representative, but do they have decision-making abilities? Are they able to take actual decisions that are consequential? And I think these questions are very valid, and the government still has a lot to do to project a level of inclusivity and diversity that can give confidence to millions of Syrians.
Yeah, and looking back, it may have been too ambitious of a goal, and this came at a time when not only did al-Shara just come to power in defeating Assad, but also when there were still sanctions in place from the United States, and one of the top demands was this inclusivity from the Biden administration. We're not necessarily hearing the same demands and focus on demands from the Trump administration, who we should note, as we did just a few weeks ago, lifted those sanctions on al-Shara and his government. Let me bring up Israel's role here, because Israel, as we noted, launched airstrikes on Saweda on Tuesday last week after the Syrian government entered this Druze city, and the Israeli government has pledged to protect the Druze community there. In a joint statement by the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, here's what they said. Israel is committed to preventing harm being inflicted on the Druze in Syria, owing to the deep covenant of blood with our Druze citizens in Israel and their historical and familial link to the Druze in Syria. We are acting to prevent the Syrian regime from harming them and to ensure the demilitarization of the region adjacent to our border with Syria. What is the view in Syria about how far Israel will actually go in its defense of the Druze?
Damascus is incredibly concerned about Israeli policy and military actions in Syria. They've been very concerned since day one of the transition, and they have valid reasons to. Just in the first few days of Assad following, Israel went in really quickly and almost obliterated Syria's military infrastructure. They captured territory west of the Golan Heights. They started building military infrastructure of their own in these areas. Initially said that the military campaign is temporary, but it seem like it. Fast forward 7 months, it is still ongoing. They've been targeting assets across the country. They just in the last couple of months hit very close to the presidential palace. In their rhetoric, they've talked about protecting Druze, but they've also talked about protecting Kurds. Now, the Druze are a special minority group for Israel because they are established both in Israel and Lebanon, but also, in Syria and Lebanon, but also in Israel, and they are in quite influential positions in Israel. So when they escalate rhetorically against the government and in favor of the Druze community, that is also signaling internally to the Druze in Israel that they are protecting them in Syria. So they're sending messages trying to, as I said, they're signaling internally, but they're also signaling to Damascus to try to kind of slow down their military progress in recapturing the area. If you ask me, I don't think they're going to be able to stop the central government from capturing remaining parts of Syria. I think it's a matter of time before that happens. But they're slowing it down. They're raising the cost of that for them. And again, it's very worrying for Damascus, especially that Bashar and the foreign minister, Asad Shabani, have been quite de-escalatory in their tone in messaging towards Israel. They have signaled publicly and privately for a long time that they're not in the business of picking a fight with their neighbors, specifically Israel. They know that their balance of power is tilted against them. And On the contrary, they've actually flirted with the idea of a potential normalization agreement with Israel. So, they are moving in a very different direction than what Tel Aviv is at the moment.
Yeah, and this normalization idea between Syria and Israel is something that's really being pushed by the Trump administration right now as well. I wish I could keep speaking with you longer because you have actually spoken with and interviewed al-Shara a number of years ago. So I'm so curious to get your perspective on his evolution, which just means we're going to have you back on the show very soon to continue this conversation. Doreen Khalifa, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.